Sadly, when it comes to sports, a lot of times, the only person that matters is the champion. Second place is often known as the first loser, or just another loser. And I don't say this to be disrespectful to the San Francisco 49ers at all, because they had a great 2012 season, and nothing should diminish that by any stretch of the imagination. But it is incredibly difficult to get all the way to the Super Bowl and come this close and ultimately fall short. It's got to be a frustrating feeling for the players, the organization, the fans, what have you. Well, let's be fair. 2012 still was a very, very, very good season for the San Francisco 49ers. They went 11-4-1, won their division, the NFC West. When you look at how they played throughout the course of the season, you had several games that they won in boat race fashion. Like they would just get out to huge leads and put people away early where those teams just never had a chance. Now, 3 of the 4 losses that they had during the regular season were also boat races in the sense that they would fall behind big very early in the game and they just never really could recover. And you saw elements of both of these types of play in the Super Bowl against the Ravens, where the Ravens kind of, you could say, boat raced them the first 2+ quarters until the blackout, and then you saw the explosiveness that the 49ers did possess as a team where they were able to come storming back. I think one thing that happened for this 2012 season, perhaps the most important thing, even with the Super Bowl loss, Colin Kaepernick, his time has begun, and he is now the unquestioned man in San Francisco. The Alex Smith experience, once and for all, is over. And when you look at it, he brought a different element to the table. He really did. He brought a better arm, and he brought more athleticism from the more of a dual threat. You know, Alex Smith was a guy that could throw, and he could run a little bit, but Kaepernick just, I think, frankly, is better at both dimensions. He brought something more to the table. He brought more of an impact player type feel to the 49ers offense, and he just was better, period. And when you look at the performance in the playoffs, you look at when I talk about the boat race versus getting boat raced, you look at the divisional round game at home against Green Bay, they pretty much dominated the Packers from beginning to end and beat them 45-31. Then in the NFC Championship game against Atlanta, at Atlanta, they go down 17-0 just like that, but eventually calm down and find a way to come back and win the game 28-24. And even when you look again at the Super Bowl, you know, this was a team, they were getting boat raced early by the Ravens. They couldn't generate much of a pass rush on Joe Flacco. The Ravens were exposing the weaknesses in San Francisco's pass defense, particularly in the back half of their secondary. Their safeties suck and their corners aren't a whole lot better, frankly. But San Francisco came storming back. Once that blackout happened, they were able to regroup. They got Kaepernick on the run a little bit. That calmed him down, and he started to play it more like it was a regular game. Because in that first half, frankly, Kaepernick was terrible and Flacco was money. It looked like the game in the moment might be too big for Colin Kaepernick, but it wasn't. And he played that way throughout much of the second half, to the point where the 49ers came this close to winning the Super Bowl. Now, when you look back at the regular season, you got another really good year for the 49ers out of Frank Gore. He had over 1,200 rushing yards and 8 touchdowns. This was a team that could really run the ball very well. They finished 4th in the NFL in rushing yards. It helps when you have Frank Gore, you have other running backs that can do the job, and you have a quarterback, whether that be Alex Smith or in particular Colin Kaepernick, that can move on their feet. One other beneficial thing for the 49ers, not just Kaepernick, but also Michael Crabtree, finally started to play like a guy that you would have expected him to be in that 2009 draft when you took him in the top 10. He had 85 catches, 1,105 receiving yards, 9 touchdowns. Starting to show, and especially the chemistry that both him and Colin had together, it looks like that could potentially be a really good combination in years to come, as long as Michael Crabtree stays away from allegedly assaulting women. Keeps himself out of trouble. It looks like that could be a very nice combination for years to come. You still got Vernon Davis there. His numbers were down a little bit this year. But I think you could live with Vernon Davis's numbers being down a little bit, because at big times in big games, Vernon Davis ultimately is their difference maker on offense, because it is so hard to match up with his size, speed, athleticism combination from the tight end position for opposing linebackers and safeties. When you look at this team, one area they did struggle with at times throughout most of the season was third downs, where they were 35% in third down conversions. That's not exactly a great percentage. Not to say the team they lost to in Baltimore in the Super Bowl was that much better at it, but that's something that they definitely need to improve upon a little bit. Defensively, this was a team that, as we found out in the Super Bowl, was good, was really good statistically, but based off of matchups, could be exploited and could be made to look very average, mediocre, or even bad. During the regular season, they finished second in points allowed, third in total yards allowed, fourth in rushing yards allowed, fourth in passing yards allowed. One problem that they had was the fact that Aldon Smith generated more than half of their team's pass rush. Out of the 38 sacks the 49ers had as a team, Aldon Smith accounted for 19 and a half of them, which you could say, that was a great dominant performance by Aldon Smith, and clearly it was. But when you got to the Super Bowl and Aldon Smith was a non-factor, nowhere to really be found, and they took him out of the game, you saw the 49ers just were really never able to generate any type of heat on a pocket passer like Joe Flacco. And when you allow somebody like Flacco to sit back there and go through his reads and pick you apart, he's going to do it. And that's what happened. And that was a problem area for the 49ers at times throughout the course of the year. Is if a team managed to be able to take away Aldon Smith, you might not be in for that long of a day at the office. It might be an actually pretty good day. And it sure was in the Super Bowl. That lack of pass rush exposed the weaknesses at corner and the weaknesses at safety. Now, going into this offseason, the one good thing that works in the 49ers' favor, you would assume that Alex Smith is either going to be traded or released, whether he gets traded to a team like Kansas City, or I think somebody maybe like Jacksonville, perhaps Philadelphia, who knows, or he just gets flat out released. Other than that, they really don't have a ton of free agents. Now, sure, there could be a couple of cap casualties coming, but guys like Deshaun Goldston, Delaney Walker, Ted Ginn Jr., those are probably your biggest name free agents for the 49ers. Goldston's a guy that they put the franchise tag on last year. I'm not sure they're going to do it again. Will they work out a long-term deal with him? Maybe. Delaney Walker's a really nice number 2 tight end to have. He occasionally offers you something as a receiver, but he's really, really good as a run blocker. And Ted Ginn's a solid, pretty solid return man. But other than that, there's not a lot else that the 49ers have to worry about in terms of potentially losing through free agency this offseason, which bodes very well for them in 2013. Now, this is a team you could say a lot of good things about, and they have a couple of obvious flaws or weaknesses. But this is still a team that won 11 games, won their division, made it to the Super Bowl, and came very, very close to becoming the champions of Super Bowl 47. And you want to try and find out and understand if you're a fan of a team like, let's say, my Bears or somebody else out there, your team is picking in the top 10. You want to figure out why your team's in that position and why the 49ers made it to the Super Bowl this year. One area you have to look at is the NFL draft. Now, you look at the San Francisco 49ers, and when you look at their draft history since 2008, it's not a draft history that you sit there and say, oh my God, it's overwhelming. They just hit on player after player after player at all different rounds every year. That's not the case at all. And in fact, with all these videos, these season recaps where I've been talking about draft history as an explanation of why certain teams are in the spots that they're in and other teams are in the spots that they're in for entirely different reasons, you would think when you look at it on the surface that the 49ers kind of almost buck that trend because their 5-year draft history is not all that spectacular. But we do have to keep this in context. Whereas they might not have produced many, many, many great players out of their drafts, they've had a few real big impact players in their past few drafts, and especially guys in the right spots. Now, it helps, too, when you already have guys in place, like Patrick Willis and Joe Staley and Vernon Davis from previous drafts. That helps significantly. But you look at 2008, that draft class is pretty much a total loss, which would explain why the 2009-2010 49ers were not all that good. 2009 really has only produced Michael Crabtree, and only until this year, and especially only once Colin Kaepernick took over as starting quarterback, did Crabtree really start to play like a top 10 draft pick. You look at 2010, though. This was a pretty good class. You got Anthony Davis, your right tackle, and Mike Iupati, your stud guard. Those are 2 first-round picks on the offensive line. They were trying to establish a physical identity as a team, and it really paid off down the road. And then you got Navarro Bowman, who's become an absolute stud at linebacker on the opposite side of Patrick Willis. I mean, that's some great, that's a great job in one draft of not only finding guys that worked out, but guys that are real impact players. And you look at the 49ers from an offensive line standpoint, both of their tackles and one of their guards was a first-round pick. And you wonder why they're able to open up such big holes in the running game, and they're able to protect their quarterback relatively well. You look at 2011, and you look at the impact players that draft produced, such as Aldon Smith and Colin Kaepernick in particular. You could throw in other guys in there that started, like Chris Culver and Bruce Miller. But look at Smith and Kaepernick. You're talking about your best pass rusher, who had 19 and a half sacks this year, and your quarterback that you drafted in the second round that made a world of difference and was a primary factor in you going to the Super Bowl this year and almost winning the damn Super Bowl. Now, 2012, the only thing you've really gotten out of that class so far was a little bit of production out of Michael James, but that was only a little bit. I mean, the thing he'll be most remembered for, I think, in the Super Bowl will be his fumble. Other than that, A.J. Jenkins, what a joke first-round pick. It's almost like they have a redshirt pick as a first-rounder. So while they haven't been just resounding successes in the draft over the past 5 years in terms of having one draft where they got 5 or 6 great players or 2 or 3 drafts where they found 4 guys each year, what they haven't had in terms of depth of talent overall in the class, they've made up for in terms of impact players, and especially at the key positions. Like your 3-4 defense, you find a premier outside pass rusher. You find your potential franchise quarterback. You find 2 offensive linemen. You find your number 1 wide receiver. You kind of get my point here. That's why a big part of the reason why the San Francisco 49ers were successful this year and probably will be again next year as well. When talking about the 2013 NFL Draft and looking at the 49ers, they're in a position at pick number 31 where they're pretty much going to be looking at best player available. And that's fine. You went to the Super Bowl. You don't have necessarily a ton of team needs. But the 49ers do have some team needs, and as the Super Bowl exposed, especially because of the matchup problems they had with the Ravens offense helped expose, they do have some needs. Offensively, the biggest need you could probably argue that the 49ers have would be a true number 2 wide receiver opposite of Michael Crabtree. And if the right guy is there at pick number 31, you have to consider taking him. Maybe they could use another interior lineman, but maybe that's a position you would address perhaps later on in the draft. I would expect the 49ers to skew with a best player available on the defensive side of the ball, regardless of position type of philosophy. Because then you have needs at safety, corner, defensive end, nose tackle, outside linebacker. They have needs all over the place on that defense. For a defense that statistically was very good in the regular season and a team that went to the Super Bowl, you saw in the Super Bowl, this is far from a perfect defense. I mean, Dante Whitner sucked. Their corners were bad. Once Justin Smith got hurt, I don't think he was ever quite the same. Their defensive line kind of struggled. They could use a better nose tackle. They could use a more effective outside linebacker as a pass rusher opposite of Aldon Smith. So you're looking at guys that could potentially target at pick number 31. You're talking about a safety maybe like Eric Reed or Matt Elam if they're there. Corners like Xavier Rhodes or Desmond Trufant if they're there. Outside linebackers like Deion Jordan, Alex Okafor if they're there. Defensive linemen like Jesse Williams or Sylvester Williams or Kawan Short or John Jenkins. Maybe a center like Jonathan Cooper. Maybe a wide receiver like Tavon Austin or Robert Woods or Terrence Williams. DeAndre Hopkins, if any of those guys happen to be there. Now you might say, well, they just took a receiver in A.J. Jenkins last year. Well, where was he this year? Just saying. But the 49ers, I would expect this draft in April for them to be very defense-oriented. And that's probably the right way to go. Because now you've got your quarterback in place. You've got a stud tight end. You have what you feel is a stud number 1 wide receiver. Now you could say, if the running back is the best player available on the board, you might not think that Frank Gore has the most shelf life left, and that could very well be the case. But they have some of the pieces in place on offense where maybe they don't need to make a whole ton of changes. But if they want to go right back to the Super Bowl next year, be a contender, and try and win a Super Bowl this time around, I think they're going to have to address some of these gaping voids and deficiencies in their defense. And you might say, well, that's the secondary. I don't necessarily fully agree. Once the Ravens were able to take away Aldon Smith and shut down his pass rush, the 49ers really didn't have much of any other answer in terms of a pass rush for most of the game. They need to improve that front 7, but if a safety or a corner is there that's just too good to pass up in the first 2 rounds, then by all means, they should take him. This is a team that you would expect, in theory, to be back in contention next year, and they very well could, although they could be a victim of the Super Bowl loser hangover, because they do have some gaping holes on defense that if they don't effectively address, they're going to struggle a little bit next year. I can promise you that.